The wind came crawling down from the Sangre de Cristo peaks, dry as bone and sharp as a broken bottle, stirring the long-dead grass around the Boone place. The ranch sat half-collapsed on the high mesa like a skull left out in the sun, bleached, hollow and stubbornly still standing. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. Elias Boone moved through the silence like a shadow that had forgotten its man. He swung the corral gate shut with a hollow clang, the sound carrying across the brittle land before being swallowed by distance. His boots left slow prints in the ochre dust. Every motion was spare, exact. He did not speak. He had not spoken more than a few words at a time in 5 long years. The locals in Arroyo Rojo called him the ghost cowboy. He didn't correct them. He didn't correct anyone. His wife, Clara, had been buried under the lone cottonwood by the dry creek since the spring of '69. Folks said it was the Apaches who rode through and set fire to the ranch house, killing her and the unborn child she carried, while Elias was away driving cattle north. Elias never confirmed it. He had come back to smoke and silence and a body that no longer breathed. And after that, words seemed like an offense to the dead. Even now, 5 winters later, the smell of burnt wood rose from the soil when the wind shifted. That afternoon, a red sun was sinking over the mesa when the stagecoach came rattling out of the distance like something half-forgotten. Dust trailed behind its wheels like smoke. Elias stood at the fence line, his hands resting on the top rail, watching it approach with the same blank calm he gave to dust storms and coyotes. The coach lurched to a stop in a rattle of chains. The driver clambered down, muttered something about drop from Santa Fe, and swung the door open. She stepped down without waiting for his hand. Marisol Vega was not what this land expected. Her dress was worn but carried a trace of color, deep blue like a dying twilight. Wind lifted strands of black hair from beneath her hat, revealing sharp cheekbones and eyes like dark glass catching firelight. She scanned the dead expanse, then turned her gaze on Elias. "You are Elias Boone," she said. Her voice carried the music of Sonora's hills, softened by travel dust. "I am Clara's sister." Something inside Elias went stiller than still. She crossed the dirt toward him as if the silence didn't exist. The wind teased her skirt, showing boots scuffed by long roads. When she stopped in front of him, she stood close enough he could smell the faint citrus oil in her hair, some memory from another world. Her eyes, though, held no softness. "Only purpose, I've come to settle her estate," she said, "and I will remain until it's done." Elias's jaw shifted slightly. No words came. She frowned. "Do you understand me?" He gave a single spare nod. "Good," she said, and swept her eyes over the splintered porch, the broken shingles, the sagging barn. "Then I'll need a room. And food." She strode past him toward the cabin without asking leave, skirt swaying like the last stubborn wildflowers of the season. Elias watched her go, caught between the weight of her living presence and the hollow place she had walked into. That night, the cabin filled with shadows. Marisol moved with quiet efficiency, unpacking her trunk, lighting a lamp, coaxing a thin stew from dried beans and salt pork. She hummed soft and low, a tune without words. The sound was strange in the cabin, like a bird flying through a burned church. Elias sat by the hearth, boots planted wide, staring into the flames as if they might speak what he would not. When she placed a bowl before him, her sleeve brushed his hand. He didn't flinch, but a single spark from the fire cracked like gunshot in the silence. They ate without speaking. Outside, coyotes sang to the empty stars. After the dishes were done, she unrolled her bedroll near the far wall and lay down fully clothed, hat resting on her chest. The lamplight made her hair glimmer like wet obsidian. Elias remained by the fire, unmoving, as if carved from the same weathered wood as the chair. The night deepened. The fire sank low. Elias's eyes lifted once toward her sleeping shape across the room. Something unspoken moved behind his expression. A ghost stirring in long-abandoned rooms of him. Then he looked away, back to the dying coals. Wind pressed at the cabin walls like the world itself was holding its breath. The sun came up raw and red over the mesas, bleeding light across the dry earth. Elias Boone was already in the yard, lifting fence rails with the quiet strength of someone who had stopped noticing the ache in his body long ago. The boards creaked like old bones. Dust clung to his shoulders, turning him the color of the land itself. Marisol Vega stepped out of the cabin barefoot, her hair braided down her back like a black river, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She paused in the chill air, breathing in the sharp scent of sage and horse sweat, her eyes scanning the sprawling nothingness that had been her sister's world. The silence out here was different than city quiet. It wasn't emptiness, it was weight. It pressed against her ribs until she felt like she had to earn every breath. She started working because it was the only way not to be swallowed whole. By the end of the week, she could mend a split fence post with baling wire and grit. She scrubbed the cabin's warped floorboards until the water ran black, then stood back and stared at the ghostly pale wood beneath, wondering if her sister's feet had once stood in the same spots. At night, she cooked with the stubborn pride of someone who refused to be helpless. Thick cornmeal mush fried in pork drippings, black beans with garlic and wild onions she dug herself. Elias never thanked her. He only ate in silence, eyes fixed on the fire. But sometimes she caught him pausing a moment too long when she laughed, softly to herself. It was like watching cracks form in a wall of stone. One morning she woke, before dawn, to find a tin mug of coffee sitting on the hearth, steam curling in the cold. Elias was nowhere in sight. When she went out, she found her saddle newly mended, the worn leather patched with fresh rawhide. The work was neat, almost tender. She ran her fingers over it, then looked toward the far pasture where Elias rode like a shadow along the fence line, silent and solitary against the paling sky. That afternoon, the quiet cracked open. Marisol was walking the creek bed for kindling when she saw something move under the willows, a flash of brown skin and tangled black hair. She stopped, heart hammering. A boy lay half hidden among the stones, no older than 12, his body little more than bone and dust. His lips were split. His feet were wrapped in rags soaked dark with blood. Dios mío, she whispered and ran. Elias heard her call and came down from the ridge at a trot. He dismounted in silence, eyes narrowing as he saw the child. The boy stirred weakly, his dark eyes wide and glassy, the faint blue beadwork at his neck marking him Apache. Elias crouched, his face unreadable. Still breathing, he muttered, the first words she had heard from him in days. His voice sounded like gravel breaking under a wagon wheel. She looked at him, startled. We have to bring him in. Elias scooped the boy up without another word and carried him toward the cabin. Word traveled fast in a country this empty. By the time the sun dropped low, 3 riders from Arroyo Rojo stood outside the Boone place, horses stamping in the dust. Their coats bore the brass buttons of the Territorial Volunteer Militia. One of them, a thick-set man with a whiskey beard, spat on the ground. That's an Apache you're harboring, he said. Cavalry's coming through. You best turn him over before there's trouble. Elias stood in the doorway, shoulders filling the frame. The boy lay on a cot behind him, fevered and still. Marisol stood at his side, her hands balled in her skirt. He's just a child, she said. A child grows into a raider, the bearded man snapped. We ain't forgetting what they did here, Boone, what they did to your woman. Something flickered behind Elias's eyes, an old fire, barely there, banked under years of ash. He stepped out into the yard, boots grinding slow in the dirt. For the first time in years, his voice rose above a murmur. You think you know what happened here? The riders shifted uneasily. Wind hissed through the sagebrush. Elias's gaze locked on them, cold and steady. I rode with Harlow's column the spring Clara died. I led them through the canyons. We came at dawn. Smoke, bullets, women screaming. They said it was justice, his voice thinned to a rasp. It was slaughter. The words seemed to scorch the air as they left him. The riders stared, unsure if they had heard right. One of those bullets took Clara, Elias said. Not theirs, ours. Marisol felt the world tilt beneath her. Elias hadn't looked at her, not once. He stared past them all as if he were watching it happen again. The gun barrels flashing in the dark, the smell of burned hair, the wailing. The bearded rider shifted in his saddle. You saying? I'm saying leave, Elias said quietly. Before you carry this blood any further. Something in his tone made them obey. They turned their horses and rode off, dust swallowing them. Silence fell, deeper than before. Inside, Marisol knelt beside the boy and pressed a damp cloth to his brow, her hands trembling. When Elias finally stepped back into the cabin, she rose and faced him. Her eyes were dark fire. Why tell them, she said, if you've kept it buried this long? Elias's shoulders sagged, as if some invisible load had just grown heavier. Because he's innocent, he said. And I don't know if I deserve to save him. But I know I can't watch another child die in front of me. Something inside her softened. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something. She turned back to the boy, brushing sweat-matted hair from his brow. "Then we save him," she said simply. Elias stood in the doorway, outlined by dying sunlight, and gave a single nod. The silence between them was no longer cold. It was fragile. It was something alive. Outside, the wind carried away the hoofbeats of the riders, leaving only the smell of wood smoke and the thin, stubborn thread of life still clinging to the boy. Spring crept over the mesa like a secret, softening the hard lines of the land. The cottonwood by the dry creek flushed green again, its leaves trembling like coins in the wind. Water traced thin silver threads through the cracked bed. Calves bawled in the pastures, wobbling on new legs. Even the air smelled different, alive, damp with thawed earth and wild onion. Toe, the Apache boy, rose like something pulled back from the grave. The first weeks were fever and nightmares. He would bolt upright in the night, eyes wild, speaking words they didn't know. Elias sat by his cot then, saying nothing, his presence a still anchor in the storm. Marisol brought water broth, warm cloths. Slowly the boy's ribs stopped showing like fence slats. He began to walk again, quiet as a deer. Elias built him a small lean-to near the barn. It was rough but solid, lined with horse blankets. The boy slept there now, close enough for them to hear him breathing in the dark. Sometimes, in the blue hour before dawn, Marisol saw Elias standing at the door of the lean-to, just watching, as if keeping vigil over something he didn't believe he deserved to protect. They worked through lambing season side by side. The ranch, long half dead, began to hum with motion. Marisol proved herself quick-handed with the ewes, holding their flanks while Elias delivered slick, shivering lambs into the world. He showed her how to dry them off with burlap, how to get them on their feet fast so they wouldn't freeze. She showed him how to braid rawhide reins, humming soft songs from Sonora while her fingers moved. They barely spoke, but their silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of ghosts. It was the silence of two people listening to the same world. One afternoon, a flash flood tore through the creek bed like a wall of shattered glass. They were out trying to mend the south fence when they heard it, a deep roaring like 1,000 drums. Elias swung her up onto his horse without a word and rode hard for high ground. Water crashed through the arroyo seconds later, flinging uprooted mesquite like matchsticks. When they reached the ridge soaked with rain and mud, Marisol turned in the saddle to look at him, laughter bubbling out of her in pure disbelief. Elias only nodded, water dripping from the brim of his hat, but something like a smile ghosted the corner of his mouth. That night, they buried a stillborn lamb together behind the barn. Marisol stood in the dark, hands folded, lips moving in a quiet prayer. Elias placed his hat over his heart. Neither of them said Clara's name, but they both felt her there, the woman who had once sung to this land, who had died before her child could take its first breath. Marisol set a small carved wooden cross over the grave. Elias stood a long time staring at it, his face unreadable. Later, by Clara's real grave under the cottonwood, Marisol finally spoke. "When I was 13, she said, raiders came to our village in Sonora. My father fought. He died in the doorway. My mother was taken. I was small. They thought I wasn't worth taking." She glanced at him, then away. "I ran, hid in the goat pens until the soldiers came." Elias didn't move. Only his jaw flexed once, slowly. "I learned to be hard after that," she said. "And harder still when Clara left home. She was light. Everyone loved her. She wrote me letters full of laughter. Then they stopped coming." She drew a breath, shaky but defiant. "When they told me she was dead, I thought the world had mistaken her for me." The wind rustled through the cottonwood leaves like a whisper of old prayers. Elias's eyes were fixed on the grave. "She wasn't stronger," he said finally, his voice a low rasp. "Just braver than she knew." It was the gentlest thing he had ever said. Marisol's throat tightened. She looked at him then, and for the first time saw not the ghost cowboy, but a man hollowed by grief and still trying to stand. Days blurred into weeks. The boy toe grew bolder, following them around the pastures like a stray pup. He began teaching Marisol Apache words, cloud, horse, rain, laughing shyly when she mispronounced them. Elias watched from a distance, but sometimes his gaze lingered on her longer than he seemed to mean it to. Then came the storm. A calf went missing during a thunder-split dusk, and they rode out together across the high mesa. The sky turned black in a heartbeat, the wind tearing like claws. Rain came down in sheets so dense they could barely see the ground. Lightning split the world open. They found the calf trembling under a crumbling bluff and coaxed it out. But the trail back was washed away. They took shelter in an abandoned line shack left from the old stage line, a sagging one-room hut with gaps between the boards wide enough for the wind to moan through. Elias got a fire going in the rusted stove while Marisol stripped off her soaked shawl, her hair clinging dark to her face. Steam rose from their clothes. Rain hammered the tin roof like 1,000 galloping hooves. They sat on the floor near the fire, close enough their shoulders nearly touched. Neither spoke. The world outside was all roar and chaos. Inside, only their breathing, the hiss of wet boots drying, the smell of wood smoke and wet earth. Elias's eyes were fixed on the fire. Marisol's were fixed on his hands, broad, scarred, trembling faintly as he reached to add a log. "Do you ever wonder," she said quietly, "if we're allowed to be alive, when others are not?" Elias didn't answer at first. The fire popped, sparks jumping. Rain poured harder, drowning the land. Finally he said, "Every day." Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the air between them hummed like a plucked wire. Neither moved. Neither dared. But something shifted, silent and unstoppable as roots breaking stone. Marisol turned her face back to the fire. Elias did the same. They sat side by side in the red glow, close enough to feel each other's warmth through damp clothes, listening to the storm rage itself out. Outside, the mesa drank the rain like a dying thing tasting life again. Inside, something long buried stirred in both of them, fragile and alive. The desert wind carried a taste of iron that night, dry and sharp like the breath before a storm. The moon was a thin white scar over the black mesa. In the distance, the thunder of hooves shattered the silence of the land Elias Boone had once called home. Captain Harlow rode in with 20 cavalry soldiers at his back, sabers glinting in the dying light. Their column came down the slope like a blade through the sagebrush, stirring a halo of red dust behind them. They stopped before the corral where Elias stood, a dark figure among the pale fence rails, his hands still at his sides. "Boone," Harlow barked, swinging down from his horse with the ease of habit. His blue coat was sun-bleached, his boots polished like bone. "I hear you've taken in an Apache whelp." Elias didn't answer. His silence seemed to irritate the horses. They shifted and snorted, ears flicking. Behind the cabin window, Marisol's face hovered, tense as drawn wire. Harlow stepped closer, lowering his voice. "There's word of a Chiricahua war band massing near the Oregon Mountains. We can't risk any leaks. Hand the boy over." The old title, Boone, carried the echo of younger days, of cavalry camps and maps pinned under lantern light. Elias felt it twist inside him like rusted wire. He shook his head once, Harlow's jaw set. "I won't ask twice." "You don't have to," Elias rasped, the words cracking from disuse. "He stays." A hush swallowed the yard. Even the wind seemed to pause. Harlow studied him for a long moment, then spat into the dust. "Then pray this mercy of yours doesn't get us all killed." They mounted up and rode away, their silhouettes shrinking into the sun's last blaze. The silence left behind was heavier than their thunder. Inside, the air was taut as the cabin's rafters. Marisol stood near the hearth, her shawl clutched around her shoulders like armor. Toe sat cross-legged on the rug, carving a bird from a scrap of mesquite, oblivious to the weight that had entered the room. "Why?" she whispered. Elias poured water into a tin cup, hands trembling. "Because he's just a boy." "That's not the whole answer," she said. "I've seen you watch him like you're staring at a ghost." He froze. She stepped closer, her voice low and cutting. "You let me believe Clara was taken by the Apache. Everyone in town believes it. But the way you look at Toe, it isn't hate. It's guilt." His shoulders sagged. For a moment, the room seemed to sway, like the ground had shifted. Then he set the cup down and turned toward her fully for the first time since she'd arrived. "She wasn't killed by them," he said, each word scraped from stone. "It was my raid, my plan. We hit a camp near the Rio Penasco. Intel said warriors. There were families. Clara rode after me that night. She said she wouldn't let me carry blood on my hands again. She got caught between the lines. Bullet meant for no one." The fire hissed. Marisol's breath trembled, shallow and quick. Her eyes searched his face like she could pry the truth back out of him. "And the child she carried?" she asked, his jaw clenched. "Gone before we reached her. Something inside her seemed to fracture, not loudly but like ice breaking far beneath the surface of a river. She stepped back, one hand pressed over her mouth. "All these years," she said, "you let me mourn her as a martyr. You let me curse a people who did nothing." "I wanted to protect the town," he said, "and I couldn't bear what it made me." Marisol shook her head slowly, her dark eyes glistening in the firelight. "No, you buried her twice." Tu's knife clattered on the floor. They both turned. The boy stood stiff, his small chest heaving, black eyes wide with horror. He had understood. Without a word, he bolted for the door. The carved bird falling forgotten to the rug. Marisol started, but he was already gone. A streak of shadow into the desert night. The horses screamed when Elias tore open the barn doors. The night was black as pitch and cold as iron. The wind scouring the land like knives. Marisol struggled to saddle her mare, her braid coming loose, fury and panic painting her face. "Stay here," Elias ordered. "You don't get to order me," she snapped, jerking the cinch tight. "You've hidden enough." Then she was in the saddle and gone, her silhouette swallowed by the dark. Elias cursed under his breath and mounted up, the old motions clawing up from muscle memory. The reins burned against his palms as he spurred after her. They rode into the Badlands where the earth broke open in cracked canyons and silent arroyos. The moon was gone, swallowed by cloud, and the desert smelled of rain not yet fallen. They called his name, "To," their voices shredded by the wind. Only echoes answered, hours bled away. Marisol's lips were blue, her eyes wild with fear. "He thinks we lied," she gasped. "He thinks we'll betray him like everyone else." Elias saw her then as she truly was, fierce, unbroken, blazing against the darkness like a lantern refusing to die. He felt the weight of everything he'd buried pressing down, threatening to crush her too. A faint cry drifted on the wind. They wheeled their horses, galloping toward it. They found him on a high ridge at dawn, crouched on the edge like a hawk chick about to leap. The world below was a vast ocean of red stone and shadow. His thin shoulders trembled. Marisol slid off her horse and went to him slowly, her hands empty, her voice barely breath. Listen, Elias was wrong, but he is not what he was." The boy's eyes flicked past her to Elias, who stood frozen, stripped bare in the cold light. For a long moment no one moved. Then Elias stepped forward, dropping to one knee, his hat falling into the dirt. "I took your people from you," he said, voice raw. "I won't take you too. You can go, or you can stay. The choice is yours." To stared at him, the wind snapping his hair. At last he turned into Marisol's arms, burying his face in her shawl. She held him like he was made of glass. Elias let out a sound that was half sob, half exhale. The sun climbed the far rim of the canyon, spilling gold into the broken world. The world burned orange. Flames raced the canyon rim like wild stallions, snapping dry brush into torches, spitting embers into the sky. Smoke boiled upward, devouring the sun. Below, wind howled through stone gullies like the wailing of old ghosts. Marisol stood on a narrow shelf of rock, shawl clinging to her like torn wings, her body wrapped protectively around To. His small frame shook with coughs as the smoke clawed at their lungs. Far above, on the ridge's lip, the flash of sabers caught the firelight. Harlow's scouts. Rifles leveled, blue coats flaring in the updraft, and between them, riding hard through the smoke like a phantom pulled from the ashes, came Elias Boone. His horse was lathered, hooves slipping on the blackened stone as he thundered toward the ledge. His hat was gone, his eyes streaked with soot. The wind screamed in his ears, carrying the stench of burning mesquite and dying grass. He saw her, Marisol, backlit by fire, one arm spread before the boy like a shield. Even at this distance, he saw her eyes blaze when they locked with his. He had come for them, and he was too late, or almost. A rifle cracked. Stone burst near Marisol's foot. She didn't flinch. She tightened her grip on To's shoulders. Captain Harlow rode out from the smoke behind the scouts, his face carved from sun-bleached leather, his saber drawn. "Boone," he roared, "this ends now. Step aside or I put you in the ground." Elias reined in, horse skidding to a halt. He swung down slow, boots crunching on scorched rock, the fire's glow painting his weathered face in molten hues. He stood alone between the boy and the rifles, hands empty. Harlow's horse stamped and snorted at the heat. "You've gone soft," Harlow spat. "You used to know what loyalty meant." "I did." Elias said, voice steady for the first time in years. And it cost everything. You're harboring the enemy. They're not the enemy. They never were. The fire cracked behind them like musket volleys. Sparks whirled on the wind. The scout's eyes darted uneasy. The flames were closing fast. Stand down, Harlow ordered. Or I swear. Swear what? Elias thundered, his voice ringing off the canyon walls. That you'll silence me like we silenced them? Harlow froze. Marisol blinked, the words slicing the air open like a blade. Elias took a step closer, fists clenched, his voice like gravel ground under iron. Tell them, Harlow. Tell your fine men what we did at Rio Penasco, how we rode in thinking we were heroes, how we gunned down fireside songs and cradle songs alike, how my Clara died in the crossfire of our glory. The scouts shifted, their rifles wavering. Some looked at the ground. Others stared at Harlow, faces pale under the grime. Enough, Harlow barked, but the word cracked. His saber shook. She was carrying our child, Elias said. And I buried her under a lie you gave me. A lie this boy will not die for. The fire line hit the canyon mouth below, roaring like a living beast. Heat slammed up from the gorge in a furnace blast. The horses screamed. Sparks bit into clothing, hair, skin. Captain, one of the scouts shouted. We need to move or we'll roast here. Harlow's jaw worked. He stared at Elias, at the man who had once been his sharpest blade. Then he sheathed his saber with a sharp metallic snap. Damn you, he muttered, turning his horse. Damn you all, he wheeled away. The scouts hesitated, then followed, their rifles lowering, their silhouettes blurring in the rolling smoke as they fled the ridge. Silence cracked like a fever breaking. Only the fire remained, charging uphill, devouring sage and grass in a tidal rush of flame. Marisol stumbled toward Elias. We have to go, now. Elias spun toward the basin. Below, his cattle herd bunched together, lowing in panic, trapped by the rising flames. The canyon mouth was a funnel of heat, ready to ignite the whole ranch when the wind turned. They would lose the cabin, the land, everything, unless... Elias's breath came slow. He looked at Marisol, at the soot streaking her face, the boy pressed to her skirts. And he made his choice. Drive them west, he barked, toward the dry gulch. Now, she blinked. The wind, do it. He leapt into the saddle, spurred downhill, and tore through the choking smoke. His voice rose in a wild rebel yell as he charged at the panicked herd. The longhorns broke, hooves pounding like drums of war. Elias whipped them mercilessly, driving them straight through the outer fence, splintering rails, trampling the brush flat in their stampede. Behind them, the fire struck that ground and sputtered, starved of fuel. Marisol followed, coughing, half-blind, dragging tow onto her mare in front of her. They raced alongside the fleeing cattle as firestorms danced just behind. The air so hot it seared their throats raw. Sparks stung their faces like hornets. The sky was black smoke above and molten red below. A section of the fence went up like matchsticks. Elias swung his rope, snagged a gatepost, and yanked it free to widen the path. A burning mesquite toppled behind him, close enough to singe the tail of his horse. They cleared the ridge as the inferno roared into the old pasture, flames devouring it like a feast. The world behind them vanished in a curtain of fire. They didn't stop riding until the gulch opened ahead, bare stone, nothing left to burn. The herd thundered past, scattering down into the dry wash. Marisol slid from her horse and half collapsed to her knees, clutching tow to her chest. He was sobbing soundlessly, eyes wide and hollow with shock. Elias dismounted last, stumbling on unsteady legs. His clothes were scorched, his hair singed. For a long moment he stood apart from them, staring back at the burning ridge. The glow painted the night like a sunrise turned inside out. Marisol rose slowly, still breathing hard. Her eyes found him through the smoke. They stood like that across a few feet of ash-streaked earth, two souls dragged through hell, bound now not by grief or longing or duty, but by survival and the truth laid bare. Then, without a word, she stepped to him and pressed her forehead to his chest. His arms came around her like the closing of a circle. They held each other, trembling as the fire consumed the world they had known. The wind swept across a field of blackened earth where a ranch once stood, carrying the faint smell of char and old sorrow. The ruins had long gone cold, but Elias still walked their perimeter every morning, as if patrolling the ghost of what once was. The corral fence lay collapsed, the barn a skeleton of beams, and the house nothing but ash and nails. No one came from town anymore. Not after the gunfire, the fire, the screams that ended everything. He had lost his voice that night. Or perhaps it was taken from him, burned away with the last piece of who he was. But time has its own quiet mercy. They left the ruins behind and settled in the foothills, where the air smelled of pine and stone instead of smoke. A creek curled through the valley, silver and cold. There they raised a canvas tent, then timber walls, and slowly, something like a home took shape. Tu was the first to laugh here. It startled Elias when it happened, high and sudden like a hawk's cry. The boy had been riding the half-broke bay gelding Elias found wandering the hills, and when the animal finally obeyed his pull on the reins, To's mouth opened and joy came pouring out. Elias felt something in his chest loosen. A sound rose from his own throat, rough from disuse, a laugh, broken and raw, like a door opening for the first time in years. Marisol had been watching from the porch frame they were raising. She didn't speak, only smiled, the desert sun laying copper on her cheekbones and dark eyes. For the first time since he had known her, her shoulders seemed light. Evenings grew soft in the foothills. The wind came down the ridge, whispering through the grass. Smoke curled from their chimney, smelling of mesquite and bread. They sat together by the fire, not as fugitives or survivors anymore, but as people reclaiming something quietly human. Tu would sit cross-legged on the floor, carving animals from scraps of wood. Sometimes Elias joined him, showing him how to sharpen the blade just so, how to draw the shape from inside the grain. His voice was returning in pieces, low, gravelly words as if dragged from deep water. The boy listened wide-eyed as if every word were gold. Marisol often listened from the rocking chair, mending shirts. The lamplight haloed her hair and made her hands glow pale. There was gentleness in her now, though the fire in her spirit had not dimmed. If anything, it had been tempered like steel in water. The town still whispered about them. When Elias rode in for supplies, conversations paused. Women watched from behind curtains, men from behind whiskey glasses. He felt their stares like prickles on his neck, but no one came near. No sheriff, no bounty hunters. Perhaps the fire had burned more than timber that night. Perhaps it had burned the old order away too. He didn't tell Marisol what they said. She already knew. One moonlit night the world seemed to still. The land lay silver and blue beneath a vast sky. The wind had gone, the cicadas were silent. The creek whispered faintly in the dark. Elias lay on his back on the blanket spread near the hearth. He could hear To breathing softly in the loft above. Marisol moved quietly through the cabin, her shadow soft against the walls. She stopped beside him, not saying anything. For a long moment she stood there, the fire painting her in gold, and then she lay down beside him, not in hunger, not in desperation, simply in wordless trust. She curled her fingers into his shirt like an anchor, her forehead brushing his shoulder. His heart stuttered. The air smelled of wood smoke in her hair. The silence pressed in around them, not the haunted silence that had stalked him for years, but a new one, gentle and whole. He turned his head and whispered her name, Marisol. The sound startled him. It was soft, like a prayer spoken into the dark. Her eyes closed. She smiled without opening them, and he knew she had heard him. The silence broke, and what poured through was not sorrow, not grief, but life. Outside, the silver desert moon drifted across the sky, casting their little cabin in pale light as if the whole world were holding its breath. Watching these three souls knit themselves back together, that was my story. If it reached you, tell me what you felt. Don't let silence bury us again. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where in the world you're listening from.